The autumn rain had started just after charms class. A soft, persistent drumming against the castle's ancient windows that turned the Scottish hills into watercolour smudges of grey and green. Now, as evening settled over Hogwarts like a comfortable blanket, the rain had gentled to barely more than mist, and the stone corridors glowed with the warm light of torches that never seemed to need replacing. Emma Thornbury had claimed her favourite spot in the Ravenclaw common room nearly an hour ago, tucked into the window seat, overlooking the grounds. The curved glass was cool against her shoulder, and she'd conjured a cushion that smelled faintly of lavender, a small charm Professor Flitwick had taught them last week, though hers wasn't quite as firm as it should be. It had a tendency to deflate on one side, but Emma found she didn't mind. Imperfect magic still felt like magic. Below, the grounds were emptying as dusk approached. She could see the last few students hurrying back from Hagrid's hut, their robes dark with rain, probably having stayed too late cooing over whatever creature he'd introduced today. The lake was smooth as pewter, barely a ripple disturbing its surface. Even the giant squid seemed to have retired for the evening. The common room behind her hummed with its usual early evening activity. Quills scratched against parchment as students finished essays due tomorrow. She could hear Marcus Belby muttering about transfiguration theory, his voice tight with frustration. Someone had dropped a jar of ink on the far side of the room, and there was a flurry of Scourgify attempts, each one slightly more successful than the last. The bronze eagle knocker occasionally asked its riddles to students returning from the library, their answers drifting up the spiral staircase in pleased or puzzled tones. But Emma found herself uninterested in homework, in the common room chatter, in even the novel she'd brought from the library, a supposedly thrilling account of famous charms masters throughout history. Instead, she watched the castle itself, the way lights began appearing in windows as the day surrendered to night. Somewhere in the dungeons, torches would be casting dancing shadows on damp stone walls. In the Gryffindor Tower, the fire would be roaring. It always seemed to burn brighter there, as if the castle itself understood what each house needed. She'd been at Hogwarts for 3 years now, her 4th year just beginning its 2nd month, and yet the castle still surprised her. Yesterday, she discovered a corridor on the 5th floor that definitely hadn't been there the week before, lined with portraits of witches and wizards, all dressed in elaborate 18th century attire. When she'd asked one stern-looking wizard where the corridor led, he'd simply replied, "Where it's always led, child." Mind you, don't track mud on the carpets before dozing off mid-sentence. The great hall's tall windows glowed golden now, and Emma could picture the scene inside. Dinner would be starting soon. The house elves would be arranging platters of roast chicken and autumn vegetables, pumpkin juice in crystal pitchers, treacle tart and custard for dessert. The floating candles would be dripping wax that never reached the tables below. Students would be filing in, tired from afternoon classes, comparing homework and complaining about the weather. And the professors would be there too, at the high table. Emma shifted against her cushion, pulling her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. That was what had captured her attention this evening, watching from her window perch as she'd seen them making their way to dinner. Professor McGonagall had crossed the courtyard with her usual brisk efficiency, tartan robes somehow immaculate despite the weather, her pointed hat perfectly straight. Professor Flitwick had hurried along beside her, well, hurried in comparison to his size, chatting animatedly about something that made McGonagall's lips quirk in what might have been a smile. Professor Snape had emerged from a side entrance, his black robes billowing even in the absence of wind, moving across the grounds like a shadow with purpose. He'd paused briefly, looking up at the castle with an expression Emma couldn't quite read from her high window. Something tired, perhaps, or simply thoughtful. Then he'd continued on, disappearing through the oak front doors. Hagrid had been visible in the distance, securing his hut for the evening, his massive frame unmistakable even in the fading light. Professor Sprout had been near the greenhouses, likely checking on some plant that needed evening attention, her figure round and comforting, even from afar. They'd all been heading to dinner, to the high table, where they would sit and eat and watch over the students, as they always did. Professor McGonagall would probably purse her lips at some Gryffindor mischief. Snape would make a first-year Hufflepuff nearly cry with a cutting remark. Flitwick would bob his head enthusiastically while discussing something with Professor Sinistra. It was all so familiar, so expected. And yet, Emma found herself wondering, not for the first time, what happened after. After dinner ended and the students dispersed to common rooms and dormitories. After the great hall emptied and the enchanted ceiling dimmed to match the real sky above. After the last giggling first year was shepherded to bed and the portraits along the corridors settled into their frames for evening gossip. Where did the professors go? What did they do? It seemed such an obvious question, and yet Emma realized she'd never really considered it before. Professors existed at the high table, in classrooms, occasionally sweeping through corridors or patrolling the grounds. But beyond that, they seemed to simply vanish into the castle's vastness, reappearing the next morning for breakfast, as if they'd been stored away like chess pieces between games. But they couldn't just vanish, could they? They had to live somewhere, have private quarters, do whatever professors did when no one was watching. The thought was oddly thrilling. Emma pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging it slightly. She tried to picture Professor McGonagall in her private rooms. Would they be severe and tidy like her appearance, all straight lines and practical furniture? Or might there be something unexpected? A comfortable armchair worn soft with use, perhaps, or a shelf of books that had nothing to do with transfiguration? Did Professor Flitwick practice more charms in his spare time, or did he tire of magic and turn to ordinary pursuits? Did he read the Daily Prophet or prefer novels? Did he keep pets? She'd heard somewhere that he'd been a dueling champion once. Did he ever miss that life, the excitement and danger of it? And Snape? Emma shivered slightly, though the common room was warm. What did someone like Snape do in the evening? She couldn't imagine him relaxing, couldn't picture him doing anything that wasn't tinged with danger or darkness. But even Snape had to sleep, had to eat when no students were around to terrify. Did he just sit in the dungeons brooding? That seemed exhausting, even for him. Behind her, someone laughed, a bright, genuine sound that made Emma smile without turning around. That was Cho Chang, probably, or one of the other older students. The Ravenclaw common room had a particular quality to its laughter, she'd noticed. It was thoughtful laughter, the kind that came after clever jokes rather than simple slapstick. A portrait on the wall nearby, a medieval scholar with ink-stained fingers, cleared his throat pointedly. Emma glanced over. "Homework, Miss Thornbury," the portrait suggested, peering at her over half-moon spectacles that looked remarkably similar to Professor Dumbledore's. "Finished it already, sir," Emma replied, which was mostly true. She still had 6 inches to write on the properties of moonstones for Professor Snape, but she'd done the research. The actual writing could wait. Then perhaps some light reading, improving the mind. The portrait gestured to the book beside her. "I was thinking, actually." "Ah," the portrait nodded sagely. "Dangerous business, thinking. Leads to all manner of curiosity and questions. Still, I suppose that's what we're here for. Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure, and all that." He paused. "What are you thinking about, if I may ask?" Emma hesitated. It seemed silly to say aloud, but portraits were good at keeping confidences. It was written into most of their enchantments, apparently, a magical form of discretion. "Where do the professors go?" she asked quietly. "After dinner, after classes, when we're all in our common rooms or asleep. Where do they go? What do they do?" The portrait's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. "Curious question. Why do you wonder?" "I don't know." Emma traced a finger along the window's edge, following the lead between panes. "I suppose. They're always there when we need them, teaching us, watching over us, keeping the castle running. But they're people too, aren't they? With their own lives, their own thoughts, their own, I don't know, their own evening routines." "Indeed they are," the portrait agreed, "though I suspect you'd find their evening routines rather less exciting than you imagine. Professors are, by and large, quite ordinary once you remove the mystique of the classroom." "But what does that mean?" Emma turned fully to face the portrait now, her interest genuinely piqued. "What's ordinary for a professor at Hogwarts? It can't be the same as ordinary for anyone else." The portrait smiled, the expression crinkling the painted corners of his eyes. "You'd be surprised, Miss Thornbury. Magic or no magic, people remain fundamentally people. They grow tired, they enjoy small comforts, they have hobbies and habits and little rituals that make them feel at home." He leaned forward, conspiratorially, his voice dropping. "I knew a potions master once, not Snape, this was centuries ago, who spent every evening knitting, terrible at it too, made scarves that came out 3 meters long and uneven besides, but it soothed him, he said, gave his hands something to do while his mind rested." Emma found herself grinning at the image. Really? Really? And the headmaster of his time, a fearsome woman named Griselda, kept a garden of singing flowers in her office, used to harmonize with them for hours. Rather beautiful, actually, though she was mortally embarrassed if anyone overheard. The rain had picked up again, a gentle patter that seemed to emphasize the warmth and safety of the castle. Emma could see lights moving in windows across the way, students in other towers, professors perhaps in their offices, the eternal dance of Hogwarts life continuing in 100 unseen spaces. "So, they're just normal?" Emma asked, though she wasn't sure if she felt disappointed or comforted by the idea. "Normal in the ways that matter most," the portrait said, "which is to say, human. They have fears and joys and petty annoyances just like anyone. The difference, perhaps, is that they've chosen to dedicate those very human lives to something rather important. educating young witches and wizards, keeping this extraordinary place running, passing on knowledge that might otherwise be lost. He settled back in his frame, adjusting his painted robes. But at the end of the day, Miss Thornbury, even the greatest wizard needs to take off their boots, have a cup of tea, and rest their feet. Magic doesn't change that. If anything, it probably makes one appreciate the simple comforts even more. Emma turned back to the window, digesting this. The Great Hall's windows were fully bright now, dinner clearly in full swing. She could almost hear the clatter of dishes, the roar of hundreds of conversations, the occasional hoot of an owl delivering post. And tomorrow morning, it would all begin again. The professors would appear at breakfast, refreshed, or at least present, ready for another day of teaching and supervising and keeping generations of young wizards from accidentally turning themselves into teacups. But tonight, after dinner ended and the castle grew quiet, they would retreat to wherever it was they went. Professor McGonagall would remove that pointed hat and let her hair down. Metaphorically, at least. Emma couldn't quite imagine the stern transfiguration teacher actually loosening her tight bun. Professor Flitwick would return to his quarters, wherever those might be. Even Snape would go, somewhere. And perhaps, Emma thought, perhaps that was when they became most themselves. Not the professors that students saw, with their carefully maintained authority and dignity, but simply people who happened to teach magic for a living. People with preferences and peculiarities, with quiet pleasures and private thoughts. The idea made her smile. It made the castle feel even more alive than it already did, layered with all these hidden lives intersecting but never quite touching. Students in their common rooms, professors in their quarters, portraits gossiping along the walls, ghosts drifting through stones, house elves busy in the kitchens, suits of armor standing sentinel in corridors, all of them coexisting in this impossible, wonderful place. "Thank you," Emma said to the portrait, who had returned to reading a painted book. He glanced up, looking pleased. "For what, my dear?" "For reminding me that magic doesn't make people less human." "Ah, well." The portrait looked genuinely touched. "You're very welcome, though I think you knew that already. You were simply thinking it through. That's what Ravenclaws do best. Think things through until they understand them properly." The fire crackled somewhere behind her, and Emma heard footsteps on the stairs, probably students returning from the library before dinner. She should join them, head down to the Great Hall, fill her stomach with the house elves' excellent cooking. There was still homework to finish tonight, and she'd promised to help a second year with her astronomy charts after dinner. But for just a moment longer, Emma stayed at her window, looking out at the castle she called home, imagining all the quiet, ordinary, magical lives unfolding in rooms she'd never see, behind doors she'd never open. Professor McGonagall was probably settling at the high table right now, smoothing her robes and surveying her Gryffindors with that sharp, caring eye. In a few hours, she'd retreat to her office. And then what? Emma decided she didn't need to know exactly. The wondering was enough. The knowledge that somewhere in this vast castle, even the strictest professors had moments of softness, of rest, of simple human comfort. It made Hogwarts feel less like a school and more like a home. And perhaps, Emma thought, as she finally rose from her window seat, gathering her book and extinguishing the small light charm she'd cast earlier, Perhaps that was the real magic after all. Not the spells they learned or the potions they brewed, but the way this castle held all of them, students and staff alike, in its ancient, protective embrace. Outside, the rain continued its gentle song against the glass. Inside, the common room glowed warm and safe. And somewhere between those two spaces, in corridors and classrooms and private quarters throughout Hogwarts, life continued in all its mundane, magical glory. Emma headed toward the stairs, already composing in her mind the essay she'd write for Professor Snape. But part of her attention remained behind, still wondering, still curious about the secret evening lives of the people who made Hogwarts what it was. Tomorrow, she'd watch more carefully, notice the small things, wonder a little less abstractly and a little more specifically. The Great Hall had emptied gradually in waves. First, the younger students, shepherded off by prefects with varying degrees of patience. Then the older ones, lingering over dessert and conversation until even the treacle tart had vanished and the enchanted ceiling above reflected a sky gone fully dark. Finally, the last stragglers had departed, their voices fading down corridors, and the vast space had fallen into that particular quality of silence that only comes to places usually filled with noise. Minerva McGonagall remained at the high table a moment longer than necessary, her teacup cooling between her hands. She wasn't drinking from it anymore, hadn't been for the past 10 minutes, but holding it provided a socially acceptable reason to sit while her colleagues departed around her. Phileas had hurried off immediately after the meal ended, mentioning something about a charm he wanted to test before he forgot the precise wand movement. Pomona had gone to check on a venomous tentacular that had been looking peaky. Even Severus had swept away in his usual dramatic fashion, robes billowing despite the complete absence of wind in the hall. Now it was just Minerva and Albus, who was humming quietly to himself while reading what appeared to be a Muggle comic book he'd acquired from somewhere. She didn't ask. With Albus, it was often better not to ask. "Long day, Minerva?" he inquired, without looking up, turning a page. "They're all long days, Headmaster." "Indeed, but some are longer than others." Now he did glance at her, blue eyes twinkling over his half-moon spectacles. "I believe young Mr. Finnegan attempted to turn his desk into a duck during your afternoon class. The desk survived. Mr. Finnegan's eyebrows did not." Minerva set down her teacup with a gentle clink. "They'll grow back by morning. I may have been somewhat lenient with the counter-charms timeline." "Ah, character building." "Quite." Albus returned to his comic book, and Minerva took that as her dismissal, such as it was. One didn't truly get dismissed by Albus Dumbledore, so much as one simply recognized when the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. She rose, smoothing her robes more from habit than necessity, and made her way down from the high table. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hall, a sound she'd heard thousands of times, but which still carried a certain satisfaction. The house table stretched away on either side, clean and empty, ready for tomorrow's breakfast. The house elves would have already returned to the kitchens, though she knew from long experience that several would still be scrubbing pots and pans down below, chattering in their high voices about the students' eating habits and who had asked for extra portions. The corridors beyond were quieter still. A few portraits murmured as she passed, and she nodded to those she knew well. Phineas Nigellus gave her his usual disdainful look which she returned with perfect equanimity. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear Peeves cackling, which meant some unfortunate student was about to discover their shoelaces tied together or their bag filled with water. She considered investigating, then decided that whoever it was probably deserved it. Peeves had a peculiar sense of justice. Her office was on the first floor, not far from the Transfiguration classroom, where she spent most of her waking hours. The door recognized her approach and swung open before she reached it. A small charm she'd placed years ago, one of many tiny conveniences she'd added over decades of teaching. The moment she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, Minerva felt her shoulders drop fractionally. The public Minerva McGonagall, deputy headmistress and head of Gryffindor House, could be carefully set aside, like the pointed hat she now removed and placed on its stand by the door. Her office was not large, but it was precisely organized in a way that soothed something deep in her soul. Bookshelves lined two walls, filled with texts on transfiguration theory, magical lore, and, though few knew this, a modest collection of Muggle mystery novels she'd developed a taste for during the war. Her desk sat before the window overlooking the courtyard, its surface clear except for a neat stack of essays awaiting marking and a small silver dish that held her emergency biscuits. But it was the far corner of the room that drew her now, to the wingback chair upholstered in subtle tartan. Gryffindor colours, naturally, but muted enough not to be garish. A small side table held a lamp with a green glass shade, and beside the chair sat a hassock where she could elevate her feet when the day had been particularly taxing. Minerva crossed to this sanctuary, and with a sigh that was almost entirely contentment, removed her outer robes and draped them over a nearby stand. Beneath, she wore a simple dark dress, practical and neat. Then came the boots, sturdy, professional, completely appropriate for a woman who spent her days standing before classrooms and walking castle corridors. She unlaced them methodically and set them aside. From a small chest beside the chair, she retrieved a pair of tartan slippers, soft and slightly worn, that had been a gift from herself to herself 5 years ago on a particularly difficult birthday. She told no one about that birthday, had deflected Albus's knowing looks and Pomona's kind inquiries. Some years were simply meant to be gotten through, not celebrated. The slippers felt like mercy against her feet. Minerva settled into the chair, her chair, and allowed herself a moment of pure physical relief. Outside, rain pattered against the window, the same gentle rain that had been falling on and off all day. The lamp cast a warm circle of light, and she reached for the book she'd left on the side table that morning. Not a transfiguration text, not a mystery novel either. Instead, it was a leather journal, worn soft with handling, and a pot of ink with her favorite quill beside it. Correspondence. Wednesday evening was for correspondence. Minerva had been writing letters to former students for more years than she cared to count. It had started almost by accident, shortly after her first year of teaching, when a particularly anxious Ravenclaw girl had sent her a tentative note asking for career advice. Minerva had responded. The girl had written back, and somehow this had evolved into a tradition that now encompassed dozens of former students across multiple decades. She opened the journal to her current page, where she kept track of who she'd written to recently and who was due for a letter. The system was color-coded. She used different coloured inks to mark different categories of student. Blue for those who wrote regularly, green for those she'd heard were struggling and might need gentle reaching out, red for urgent situations, though thankfully those were rare, and gold for students who'd achieved something worth celebrating. Tonight, she had 4 letters to write. She began with the easiest, a response to Oliver Wood, who'd sent an enthusiastic 3-page description of his latest Quidditch match with Puddlemere United. Minerva had never quite understood the boy's obsession with the sport. Well, that was a lie. She understood it perfectly. She simply found it occasionally exhausting. But his joy was infectious, and his career was going well. She wrote in her neat, precise hand, "Dear Oliver, your description of the Hawk's Head attacking formation was most illuminating, though I confess I had to read certain passages twice to follow the aerial dynamics you described. I am pleased to hear the injury to your shoulder has healed sufficiently for you to return to full training. Do remember that Madame Pomfrey's advice about the strengthening exercises was meant to be followed permanently, not merely until the pain subsided. The current Gryffindor Quidditch team shows promise, though they lack your particular brand of dedicated intensity. I have not yet had to extract any players from the pitch after dark this season, which I choose to view as both a success and a mild disappointment." Minerva paused, her quill hovering. Then she added, "I was in Diagon Alley last month and happened to pass Quality Quidditch Supplies. They had one of your chocolate frog cards in the window. I thought you'd like to know it made me smile." She signed it, blotted the ink carefully, and set it aside to be sent with tomorrow's owl post. Oliver would likely read that last line a dozen times, pleased beyond measure that his stern former head of house had admitted to something as frivolous as smiling at his success. The second letter was more challenging. A former Slytherin, Marcus Flint, who'd been in Oliver's year, had written to her asking for a reference for a position with Gringotts. The boy had not been particularly academically inclined, and his time as Quidditch captain had been marked by what Minerva diplomatically thought of as enthusiastic physicality. But he'd written to her rather than to Severus, which suggested either bravery or desperation. She considered carefully before writing. "Dear Marcus, I am in receipt of your letter regarding the Gringotts position. I would be willing to provide a reference with the following observations." The letter took her longer, requiring careful honesty, balanced with the recognition that young people could grow beyond their school selves. Marcus had been rough around the edges, but he'd never been cruel, and he'd shown surprising loyalty to his team. Those qualities counted for something. By the time she finished, her tea had gone cold. She'd conjured a cup earlier more from habit than desire, and now she refreshed it with a wandless, warming charm that required barely a thought. The magic came as naturally as breathing. After so many decades, there was something almost meditative about these small, everyday enchantments that required no focus, no effort, just intention flowing into reality. The third letter brought a smile to her face. A wedding invitation, actually, from a former student, a Hufflepuff girl, Amelia Bones, who'd been one of the brightest witches of her generation. She was marrying in the spring, and she'd enclosed a note asking if Professor McGonagall might consider attending. Minerva's policy was generally not to attend former students' weddings. It created complications. which students to favour with one's presence, which to politely decline, the potential hurt feelings. But Amelia had been special. She'd gone into magical law enforcement, rising quickly through the ranks despite the old prejudices against the Muggle-borns. She was making a difference, and she'd been one of the students who'd written to Minerva regularly over the years, not asking for anything, simply staying in touch, sharing her life, treating her former professor as something approaching a friend, though neither of them would have been quite comfortable with that word. Dear Amelia, I would be honoured to attend your wedding. Please do send the details at your convenience, and let me know if there is anything I might do to assist with the arrangements. I assume the ceremony will be according to traditional wizarding custom. Do inform me if I am incorrect in this assumption, as I would hate to arrive inappropriately dressed. I am very happy for you, my dear. Edward is a fortunate young man. The fourth letter was the hardest. A former Gryffindor, Lily Evans, now Potter, had written several weeks ago, and Minerva had been avoiding the response. The letter had been cheerful, full of news about her young son Harry, now 15 months old and apparently showing signs of accidental magic already. But there had been lines between the lines, a tension in the words that spoke of fear carefully controlled. Lily and James were in hiding. Minerva knew this, though not precisely where or under what protections. The war with Voldemort touched everything now, cast shadows even into Hogwarts walls, though they did their best to keep the students safe and unaware of the worst of it. She picked up her quill, then set it down, picked it up again. What did one write to a former student living under the shadow of a death sentence? Lily had been brilliant, brave, talented, head girl, for heaven's sake, and one of the few students Minerva had taught who seemed to have a natural gift for transfiguration that rivaled her own. She deserved a life of peace and achievement, not this hiding, this constant fear. Dear Lily, thank you for your letter. I was delighted to hear about Harry's progress. Turning his father's hair blue sounds entirely appropriate, given James's own history of mischief. I have no doubt he is growing into a remarkable young wizard. She paused, chewing her lip, an inelegant habit she thought she'd trained herself out of decades ago. These are difficult times. I wish I could offer you more than words, but please know that you remain in my thoughts. Your strength, your courage, your determination to protect your family, these are the qualities that made you such an exceptional student, and they will serve you well now. Whatever happens, Lily, remember that love is the most powerful magic we possess. Albus often says this, and I have occasionally found it irritatingly vague, but I believe it is true nonetheless. You and James have built something worth protecting. That matters. Please give my regards to James, and a gentle pat on the head to young Harry. Minerva signed the letter, then stared at it for a long moment. It felt inadequate, these few lines against everything Lily was facing. But what else could she offer? Empty reassurances would insult them both. She sealed the letter carefully and added it to the outgoing pile. The rain had intensified outside, and the castle had settled into its nighttime rhythms. Minerva could hear the faint sounds of pipes shifting, stones settling, the gentle respiration of an ancient building at rest. Somewhere above, students would be in their dormitories, giggling over gossip or struggling with last-minute homework. Prefects would be doing their final rounds. Ghosts would be drifting through walls, and portraits would be visiting each other's frames. And here she sat, in tartan slippers, writing letters by lamplight. It was not a glamorous life, perhaps. It was not filled with adventure or acclaim. But it was hers, and it was enough. Minerva set aside her correspondence and reached for the small basket beside her chair. Inside were balls of wool in various colors: deep reds, golds, oranges, and yellows. Autumn colors, warm and comforting. And beneath them, half finished, was her current project. She'd taken up knitting during the First War with Grindelwald, a young teacher then, needing something to occupy her hands during the anxious evenings when news came slowly and often badly. The habit had stuck. Most people didn't know. She certainly never knitted in public, but in the privacy of her office, it soothed something that Transfiguration's precision could not reach. Tonight, she was making a blanket. Not for herself. Her quarters already had more blankets than any single person needed. This one was destined for St. Mungo's children's ward. She'd been donating them anonymously for years, little squares of enchanted warmth that she spelled to be extra soft, to smell faintly of whatever the child found most comforting, to maintain the perfect temperature. The magic was subtle, woven into the knitting itself. Each stitch carried intention. Each row held protection. It was what her grandmother had called hearth magic, the small enchantments of home and care that required no wand, only love and attention. The needles clicked rhythmically, and Minerva let her mind wander as her hands moved through familiar patterns. She thought about her students, the current crop of Gryffindors, with their varying degrees of courage and recklessness. Young Granger, who reminded her so much of herself at that age, hungry for knowledge and desperate to prove herself worthy. Longbottom, who doubted himself far more than he should. The Weasley twins, who would either become brilliant inventors or end up in Azkaban, possibly both. She thought about the war, though she tried not to dwell. Albus had his plans, his secrets. She trusted him, but that didn't make the waiting easier, didn't make the losses hurt less. Students who'd sat in her classroom were fighting now, were dying. Some had already died. The list of names grew longer, but she couldn't think about that too much, or she'd never sleep. Instead, she focused on the knitting, on the simple magic of creating something warm and protective. One more blanket for one more child who might need comfort. It was such a small thing against the darkness, but small things mattered. Sometimes they were all that mattered. The blanket was nearly finished now, just a few more rows. She'd bind it off tomorrow, add the final protective charms, and send it along to St. Mungo's with the next batch of medical supplies. Some child would wrap themselves in it and feel safer, even if they never knew why, never knew that their blanket had been knitted by one of the strictest professors at Hogwarts, while rain fell on ancient stones. When she finally set aside the knitting, her eyes were heavy. The clock on her mantel, a gift from her mother decades ago, showed 11:30. Late, but not unreasonably so. She'd grade essays tomorrow during her free period. Minerva performed her evening ablutions in the small washroom adjoining her office, then padded through to her private quarters beyond, a bedroom even more austere than her office, with a narrow bed covered in that tartan she loved, a wardrobe, a small bookshelf with her most treasured volumes. She changed into a nightgown, removed the pins from her hair, and let it down, such a relief. and climbed into bed. With a wave of her hand, the lamps extinguished themselves, leaving only the faint glow from the enchanted stones in her fireplace, enough light to keep the darkness at bay, but not enough to prevent sleep. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion. Inside, Minerva McGonagall closed her eyes and let herself simply be Minerva, not professor, not deputy headmistress, not head of house. Just a woman who taught transfiguration, who wrote letters to former students, who knitted blankets for children she'd never meet. Just a woman who called Hogwarts home. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of Lily Potter's letter, of young Harry turning his father's hair blue, of the small, ordinary magics that made life worth protecting. Then she slept and dreamed of nothing in particular, and rested for whatever tomorrow would bring. The corridor leading to Phileas Flitwick's private quarters was one that most students never discovered, tucked as it was behind a tapestry on the 3rd floor, depicting a somewhat confused-looking wizard attempting to teach a dragon to play the harp. The tapestry itself served as the door, swinging aside when approached by someone the castle recognized as permitted entry, which, in practice, meant Phileas himself and occasionally a house elf bearing fresh linens or tea. Tonight, as Phileas reached the tapestry, standing on tiptoe to move it aside properly, a necessity that had long since ceased to bother him, he was humming. He'd been humming since leaving the great hall, a lilting melody in a minor key that had come to him during dessert while watching the first years discover chocolate eclairs for the first time. Their expressions of wonder had sparked something musical in his mind, a theme that wanted development, elaboration. His quarters, when he stepped inside, welcomed him with the particular warmth of a space that had been shaped over decades to suit one person perfectly. Where Minerva's office spoke of organization and efficiency, Phileas's rooms sang of comfortable chaos held together by an underlying harmony only he fully understood. The main room was not large. His small stature meant he required less space than most, but every inch had been utilized with clever charm work. The ceiling was higher than standard, enchanted to show not the sky above, but rather a representation of musical notation that shifted and changed based on his mood. Tonight, it displayed the melody he'd been humming, the notes writing themselves in golden light against a deep blue background. Bookshelves lined the walls, but unlike Minerva's orderly collections, these were stacked in seemingly haphazard arrangements. Books on charms next to volumes on musical theory, biographies of famous duelists beside collections of fairy tales. A student would have called it messy. Phileas called it organic organization, where books arrange themselves based on conversational potential rather than alphabetical order. But it was the plants that dominated the space. They were everywhere, on shelves hanging from the ceiling, arranged on specially constructed stands that spiraled upward to make use of vertical space. Magical and mundane species grew side by side in harmonious profusion. A flutterby bush occupied one corner, its leaves rustling even in the still air. Dirigible plums hung like small lanterns from a plant Phileas had acquired from a former Ravenclaw student who'd gone on to become a rather eccentric botanist. Ordinary ivy climbed the walls, enchanted to never grow beyond its designated boundaries, its leaves a deep, healthy green. And positioned strategically throughout were his pride and joy, singing plants. Phileas had been collecting them for 30 years, ever since a holiday to Ceylon had introduced him to a rare specimen of melodious fern that hummed in response to morning dew. That first plant had sparked an obsession that had since grown to encompass 17 different singing species, each with its own unique voice and temperament. He removed his travelling cloak, a rather dashing purple one he'd acquired in Diagon Alley last summer, and hung it on a hook that had been lowered to an appropriate height. Then he crossed to a small cabinet and retrieved what appeared to be a tiny watering can, no larger than a teacup, made of silver that had been polished to a mirror shine. "Good evening, my dears," he said cheerfully to the room at large. "I hope you've had a pleasant day." The plants, as always, responded. The flutterby bushes rustling increased slightly, a sound like applause. The melodious fern, now quite mature and sprawling across an entire shelf, hummed a welcoming note in a deep bass that seemed impossible for such a delicate plant. From a hanging basket near the window, a soprano succulent trilled a greeting, its notes bright and clear as bells. Phileas smiled, a genuine expression of delight that he rarely allowed himself in the classroom, where dignity and authority had to be maintained. Here, in his private sanctuary, he could be simply himself, a wizard who happened to have a deep and abiding love for both magic and music, and who had found a way to combine them in the most literal sense possible. He began his evening routine, moving from plant to plant with the silver watering can. It was enchanted, of course, filled not just with water, but with a solution of his own devising that included powdered moonstone, a drop of dew collected from a spider's web at dawn, and an infusion of valerian root. The mixture encouraged the magical plant's singing properties while keeping the mundane ones healthy and vibrant. As he watered, he hummed that melody from dinner, letting it develop and grow. The plants responded, their own voices joining his in a slowly building harmony. The melodious fern provided the bass line, steady and grounding. The soprano succulent wove around his melody with counterpoint that was almost eerie in its appropriateness. A cluster of chiming chrysanthemums added percussion, their leaves rattling in rhythm. This was what Phileas lived for, these moments when magic and music became indistinguishable from each other. During the day, he taught charms, taught students the precise wand movements, the correct pronunciation, the theory and application of spell work. It was important work, necessary work, and he took pride in it. Many of his former students had gone on to become exceptional witches and wizards, and he treasured every letter of thanks, every expression of gratitude for his patience and instruction. But this private communion with singing plants and developing melodies, this fed something deeper in his soul. He finished watering and set the can aside, then moved to a particular corner of the room where a plant unlike any of the others grew in a large, ornate pot. It was a nocturne nightshade, rare and temperamental, that only sang in the hours between midnight and dawn. Phileas had acquired it 5 years ago from a witch in Prague, and it had taken him 3 years to convince it to bloom properly. Now it was the centerpiece of his collection, its dark purple flowers closed tight during daylight hours, waiting for true night to reveal their glory. It was not quite time yet. The nightshade preferred the deepest hours of darkness, but Phileas wanted to check on it, ensure it had everything it needed for tonight's performance. The soil was moist, the temperature appropriate. He cast a gentle diagnostic charm, watching the soft blue light play over the leaves, checking for any signs of distress or disease. Healthy, thriving even. Good. From another cabinet, this one decorated with musical notes that had been inlaid in mother of pearl, Phileas retrieved a small wooden case. Inside, cushioned in velvet, lay his wand. Not his everyday teaching wand, which was currently tucked in his robes, but his dueling wand. He hadn't used it in years, decades, really, but he kept it maintained, kept it ready because some things were too important to let fall into neglect, even if their time had passed. The wand was longer than his current one, slightly heavier, and made of ash wood with a core of dragon heartstring. It had served him well during his competitive dueling days, when he'd been younger and faster and, frankly, more reckless. He'd won the Britain Dueling Championship at 26, a record that still stood for the youngest champion ever. The trophy was somewhere in a box in his storage cupboard. He didn't display it, seemed rather like boasting, and besides, that part of his life felt like it belonged to someone else now. Still, he liked to hold the wand sometimes, feel its familiar weight, remember what it had felt like to be that young man, full of fire and competitive spirit, ready to prove himself against any opponent. Phileas traced his thumb along the wand's length, feeling the smooth wood, the faint warmth that never quite left it. Then he carefully replaced it in its case and returned the case to the cabinet. Some memories were best kept as memories, taken out occasionally for examination, but not dwelt upon too long. He was Phileas Flitwick, Charms Professor now. That was enough. That was good. A soft mewing sound drew his attention to the corner, where a small door, cat-sized, swung open, and a Kneazle padded in. Her name was Aria, and she was getting on in years now. Her once bright ginger fur faded to a softer orange cream color, but her eyes were still sharp, still intelligent with that particular knowing look that Kneazle's had. "There you are," Phileas said, bending down, which, given his height, wasn't terribly far, to scratch behind her tufted ears. "Out mousing, were you? I hope you left some for Mrs. Norris, or Filch will complain again." Aria made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been contradiction. With Kneazles, it was often hard to tell. She wound around his ankles once, twice, then made her way to her favorite cushion, a plush red velvet affair positioned near the flutterby bush, and settled down with the satisfied air of one whose duties for the day were completed. Phileas smiled and moved to his own favorite chair, a comfortable affair that had been modified to accommodate his proportions. Beside it stood a small table holding his current reading, a fascinating treatise on the relationship between wand movements and musical conducting, written by a witch in Vienna who'd made a career of combining the two disciplines. He'd been corresponding with her for 6 months now, comparing notes and theories. But tonight, he found he wasn't in the mood for reading, even fascinating reading. The melody from dinner was still running through his mind, wanting attention, wanting to be properly developed. And the night was still young, barely 9 o'clock. The nightshade wouldn't sing for hours yet. He retrieved his teaching wand and a small silver baton from the table drawer. The baton was another indulgence, made for him by a wand maker in Diagon Alley who specialized in unconventional magical instruments. It wasn't strictly necessary. He could conduct with his wand alone, but something about the baton's weight and balance made the magic flow more smoothly, more musically. Phileas stood and moved to the centre of the room, where a small, clear space allowed for what he privately thought of as his conducting practice. The plants had settled into a gentle ambient sound, a soft background hum of various tones and textures. Now he would shape that sound into something more, something intentional. He raised the baton, wand in his other hand, and began. The magic that flowed from Phileas Flitwick in these moments was subtle, nuanced, in ways that most witches and wizards never explored. He wasn't casting specific spells so much as suggesting possibilities, encouraging the plant's natural magical inclinations toward particular harmonies, rhythms, dynamics. It was charm work at its most refined, the difference between shouting an order and whispering an invitation. The melodious fern responded first, its bass hum shifting to match the melody he'd been developing. He guided it gently, showing it the phrase he wanted, then letting it interpret in its own voice. The soprano succulent joined in, and Phileas directed it toward a counter-melody weaving above and around the main theme. The chiming chrysanthemums picked up the rhythm, and he shaped their percussive rattling into something structured, purposeful. More plants joined the ensemble, each adding their unique voice to the growing composition. A whistling willow contributed sustained high notes that hung in the air like starlight. A cluster of harmonic heather provided a middle voice, rich and warm. Even the ordinary ivy seemed to sway in time, its leaves rustling in rhythm, though it could not truly sing. Phileas conducted with his whole body, small as it was. His arms moved through the air, tracing patterns that were part musical conducting and part wand work, the two disciplines flowing together seamlessly. He swayed, he stepped, he turned, completely lost in the music he was helping to create. This was the magic they didn't teach at Hogwarts, not because it was dark or dangerous, but because it required a combination of skills and sensibilities that most wizards never developed. It required understanding charms at an intuitive level, yes, but also understanding music, understanding how sounds related to each other, how to build and release tension, how to create beauty that went beyond mere technical proficiency. The melody built, growing more complex, more layered. Phileas pushed the plants gently toward a crescendo, feeling the magic surge through him, through the room, through the very stones of Hogwarts itself. For a moment, the music was everything, not separate sounds, but a single unified voice, speaking something too profound for words. Then, with a final flourish of his baton, he brought the piece to a gentle close, letting the voices fall away one by one, until only the melodious fern remained, humming a final sustained note that slowly faded into silence. Phileas lowered his arms, breathing heavily. Aria, from her cushion, made a sound that might have been approval. The plants rustled and swayed, settling back into their usual ambient sounds, satisfied with the performance. It was good, not perfect. He'd pushed the soprano succulent a bit too hard during the bridge, and the timing on the chiming chrysanthemums had been slightly off in the third section. But good. He'd write the composition down later, notate it properly so he could refine it. Perhaps he'd even send a copy to his correspondent in Vienna. She'd appreciate the way he'd used the natural properties of the plants rather than forcing them into unnatural harmonies. He returned to his chair, pleasantly exhausted in the way that only creative work could make one feel. Aria hopped down from her cushion and came to sit on his lap, a warm, purring weight that grounded him back in the physical world after the transcendence of music. The clock on his mantel, a musical one, naturally, that chimed the hours in different keys, showed 9:30. Still early by Phileas's standards. During his dueling days, he'd regularly stayed awake until 3 in the morning, too energized by competition and adrenaline to sleep. These days, he was usually in bed by midnight, an old goblin's habits reasserting themselves, but the evening still held possibilities. He considered working on his correspondence with Vienna, or perhaps reviewing tomorrow's lesson plans. He was introducing third years to cheering charms, which required careful supervision to prevent overly enthusiastic casting. But his gaze kept drifting back to the nocturne nightshade, its flowers still closed tight, waiting for true darkness. It would be several hours yet before it sang. The nightshade was particular about its timing, only performing in the deepest part of night when the castle slept and even the ghosts grew quiet. Phileas had arranged his rooms with various cushioning charms so that the plant song wouldn't disturb anyone. But in truth, few students came near this corridor anyway, and the portraits knew better than to complain about music. He decided to wait for it. He would read his treatise, perhaps doze a bit in his chair with Aria on his lap. And when midnight came, he would be here to listen to the Nightshade's aria. It only performed a few times per week, and one never knew when the mood would strike it. Missing a performance felt like a small tragedy, a moment of beauty lost because he'd chosen sleep over vigilance. So Phileas settled deeper into his chair, opened his book, and began to read about the parallels between conducting patterns and wand movements, occasionally glancing up to check if the nightshade's flowers had begun to open. Aria purred on his lap. The other plants hummed and rustled in their contented way. The enchanted ceiling above displayed his earlier melody in slowly fading golden notes. This was his life, Phileas reflected with deep satisfaction. By day, he taught young witches and wizards the technical precision of charms, the proper swishes and flicks, the theory and application. He maintained order in his classroom, commanded respect despite his small stature, and took pride in his students' achievements. But by night, he was something else entirely. A musician without instrument, a conductor of the natural world's magic, a goblin who'd found a way to bridge the divide between his heritage and his adopted wizarding culture through the universal language of music. He'd been champion duelist once, had proven himself in combat, had earned respect through skill and daring. But these quiet evenings with singing plants and developing melodies, this was where he felt most himself. The book grew heavy in his hands. His eyes drifted closed. Aria's purring was a lullaby all its own. When Phileas startled awake, the clock was chiming midnight in a clear, bright C major, and the nocturne nightshade's flowers were opening, their deep purple petals unfurling like velvet curtains to reveal throats of silver and gold. The plant began to sing. It was nothing like the other plants' voices, where they hummed and trilled and chimed. The nightshade sang with something approaching consciousness, its voice ethereal and haunting, a soprano of impossible purity that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the ordinary world. The melody it sang was ancient, unchanging, a song it had been singing for centuries and would continue to sing long after Phileas was gone. He listened, transfixed, as he always was. No matter how many times he heard it, the Nightshade's song never failed to move him, never became ordinary or expected. It was magic in its purest form, beauty that required no justification beyond its own existence. The song lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though time felt strange while the nightshade performed. Then the flowers slowly closed, the voice faded to silence, and Phileas was alone again in his quarters, with only the gentle rustling of ordinary plants and Aria's soft breathing. He sat for a long moment in the silence that followed, feeling grateful for magic, for music, for singing plants and patient neasels, for Hogwarts and its ancient stones, for the life he'd built in these rooms. Then finally, he rose from his chair, carefully so as not to disturb Aria, and prepared for bed. Tomorrow there would be classes to teach, students to instruct, the daily responsibilities of being Professor Flitwick. But tonight, he had heard the nightshade sing, and that was enough. That was more than enough. The dungeons of Hogwarts were not, strictly speaking, cold. Warming charms had been placed on them centuries ago, renewed regularly by each generation of staff, ensuring that students attending potions classes wouldn't lose fingers to frostbite or have their cauldrons crack from temperature fluctuations. But they retained a quality of coolness that had nothing to do with actual temperature, a dampness that seemed to seep from the very stones, a darkness that lingered even in the brightest wand light. Severus Snape had always found this quality soothing. He descended the final staircase from the entrance hall, his footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor, robes billowing behind him in a way that was less dramatic affectation and more simple practicality. The dungeons had drafts that caught fabric easily, and he'd long since learned to use this to his advantage when sweeping dramatically away from impertinent students. The effect had become habit, and now he billowed even when no one was watching. The potions classroom was dark and empty, its rows of desks cleaned by house elves hours ago, cauldrons stored, ingredients locked away in his private supplies cupboard. The preserved specimens in jars along the walls gleamed faintly in the dim light from the corridor. Pickled slugs, lacewing flies suspended in amber liquid. A rat's spleen that he kept purely because it made first years uncomfortable. He didn't linger in the classroom. It was a workspace, nothing more, and his work there was done for the day. Instead, he continued past it, down a narrower corridor that few students even knew existed, to a door that was not hidden, but simply overlooked. One of those architectural features that the castle seemed to arrange so that eyes slid past it without quite registering its presence. His private laboratory. Severus opened the door with a non-verbal unlocking charm. He rarely spoke, spells aloud when alone, finding the mental discipline required for silent casting to be a useful meditation, and stepped inside. The room beyond was larger than his classroom, stretching back into darkness that gradually illuminated itself as he entered, sconces along the walls flickering to life with a cool, steady light that was easier on the eyes than bright flames would have been. Where the classroom was functional and somewhat theatrical, he'd arranged it over the years to be maximally intimidating to students who needed intimidation. This space was purely utilitarian. Work tables lined the walls, their surfaces scarred from years of spills and burns, scrubbed clean but permanently stained by substances that had long since soaked into the wood. Glass-fronted cabinets held ingredients arranged with meticulous precision, each jar labeled in his small, precise handwriting. Cauldrons of various sizes hung from hooks overhead, organized by material and purpose rather than any decorative consideration. This was where Severus did his real work. He removed his outer teaching robes and hung them on a hook by the door, then rolled up the sleeves of his shirt. Black, always black, because lighter colors showed stains, and he couldn't be bothered with the vanity of maintaining pristine clothing when working with volatile substances. His forearms were pale and marked with the silvery traces of old burns, scars that no amount of dittany had fully erased. Occupational hazards of experimental potions work. Tonight's project was waiting for him on the central table, exactly as he'd left it that morning before breakfast. A pewter cauldron, medium-sized, contained a potion that had been simmering for 6 days now, its surface a deep purple that occasionally flickered with threads of silver. Beside it sat his notes, pages of parchment, covered in his writing, equations and observations, sketches of molecular structures that few other potions masters would recognize because he developed his own notation system years ago. He was attempting to modify the draft of peace, reduce its brewing time without compromising effectiveness. The standard version required 28 days of careful preparation, which made it impractical for situations requiring urgent treatment. If he could reduce that to 14 days, or even 7, while maintaining potency well, it would be a significant contribution to the field. Not that he'd receive recognition for it. His contributions to potions theory were published under a pseudonym, Tobias Prince, a combination of his father's name and his mother's maiden name that allowed him to participate in academic discourse without the complications that came with being Severus Snape, Death Eater turncoat, spy, the man who'd killed Albus Dumbledore. No, he pushed that thought away before it could fully form. Dumbledore was alive, sitting in his office above with his sherbet lemons and his secrets. That particular nightmare hadn't come to pass yet, and Severus refused to dwell on futures that might never arrive. He focused on the potion instead. The color was promising. That silver flickering indicated the moonstone essence was integrating properly with a Valyrian root base. He checked the heat with a wave of his wand, adjusting it down by 1/2 degree. Temperature was critical at this stage, too hot, and the hellebore would break down prematurely. Too cool, and the powdered porcupine quills wouldn't dissolve completely. Severus pulled out his battered pocket watch, the only possession he still owned from his mother, its silver case tarnished and dented, and noted the time. In 3 hours, he'd need to add the next ingredient, a single drop of dew collected from morning glory flowers before sunrise. He'd harvested it himself last week, storing it in a crystal vial enchanted to maintain the exact properties it had possessed at the moment of collection. 3 hours. Enough time for his other project. He moved to a different table, this one positioned near the far wall, where a series of small glass terrariums were arranged on shelves. Each contained a different plant, and unlike Professor Sprout's exuberant botanical collections, these were all nocturnal species, plants that bloomed in darkness, that thrived in shadow, that required the moon rather than the sun. Moonflower vines climbed delicate trellises in one terrarium, their white blooms closed tight during the day, but now beginning to open, releasing a scent like jasmine and something stranger, something that made the air feel thicker, more dreamlike. Night-blooming Sirius occupied another, its enormous flower just beginning to unfurl, a rare event that only occurred a few times each year. Shadow roses, a variety he'd crossbred himself, combining ordinary black roses with a species of magical flora that absorbed light rather than reflected it, created patches of deeper darkness in their container. These plants were not for decoration. Each served a purpose in various potions he was researching. Moonflower essence was critical for several advanced sleeping draughts. The Cereus bloom, harvested at the peak of opening, could be used in potions that enhanced night vision. The shadow roses, those were more experimental. He was investigating their potential in potions designed to help wizards hide from detection, to literally fade into shadows. The Aura office would pay well for something like that, assuming he could ever get it to work properly. But beyond their practical applications, Severus found the process of tending them to be not relaxing, exactly. He didn't relax, but absorbing. A task that required enough attention to quiet his mind's constant churning without demanding the intense focus that experimental potions work required. He checked each plant systematically, testing soil moisture with a diagnostic charm, adjusting enchantments that maintained optimal growing conditions, removing a few dead leaves from the moonflower with a pair of silver tweezers. The work was meditative, methodical, and for perhaps 20 minutes, his mind was almost peaceful. Almost. The problem with quiet moments, Severus had discovered over years of unwilling experience, was that they invited thoughts, and his thoughts were never pleasant company. He found himself thinking about the classroom earlier, about the third-year Gryffindor, Longbottom, useless as ever, who'd managed to melt his cauldron despite explicit instructions and a demonstration that even a troll should have been able to follow. The boy was a menace to himself and others, completely incapable of following the simplest directions. And yet, there was something almost admirably persistent about his continued survival in a subject he was so spectacularly unsuited for. Severus had assigned him detention, of course, had taken points from Gryffindor, had made the boy clean up his mess without magic, which was standard procedure and not at all vindictive, regardless of what Minerva might suggest in her pointed way during staff meetings. But he'd also, when no one was looking, cast a subtle diagnostic charm on the boy's cauldron before it had melted completely. Just to confirm what he'd suspected, the pewter was substandard, likely from a batch of cheap cauldrons that had been purchased in bulk for student use. A better cauldron might have withstood the potion's heat long enough for Longbottom to realize his mistake and correct it. Not that he'd mention this to anyone. Let them think him purely vindictive. It was safer that way. His mind drifted, inevitably, to the other Gryffindor third year in that class, Potter, Harry Potter, who looked distressingly like James. Same untidy hair, same build, same irritating confidence, but who had his mother's eyes? Lily's eyes, green as fresh pickled toads, to borrow Lockhart's nauseating phrase, though the comparison did them no justice. They were simply green, vivid, alive. Severus gripped the edge of the work table harder than necessary, forcing himself to breathe evenly. This too was an old wound, one that time had scabbed over, but never truly healed. He'd made his choices. He'd said unforgivable things. He'd lost her long before she died, lost any right to her friendship or forgiveness through his own stupidity and pride, and no, this line of thinking served no purpose. He turned deliberately away from the plants and moved to a locked cabinet at the far end of the room. This one required 3 separate charms to open, and the contents were warded against casual inspection. Inside, among vials of rare ingredients and volatile substances that could be dangerous in inexperienced hands, was a small wooden box. Severus had not opened this box in 3 years, wasn't entirely sure why he was reaching for it now, but his hands moved of their own accord, lifting it carefully, feeling the familiar weight. Inside, on a bed of black velvet, lay a single photograph. It had been taken when they were 15, during a summer break. Lily stood in a garden, her parents' garden, small and ordinary and meticulously maintained, laughing at something outside the frame. Her red hair caught the sunlight, and she wore a simple muggle dress, green like her eyes. She looked happy, young, alive. The photograph didn't move because it was a muggle photograph. Severus's mother had taken it, one of the last times she'd accompanied him to visit Lily's family before everything had fallen apart. He'd stolen it from his mother's belongings after her death. This single frozen moment when Lily had still been his friend, when the future had still held possibilities beyond darkness and regret. He stared at it for longer than he should have, thumb tracing the edge of the frame without quite touching the image itself. Then, with deliberate care, he closed the box and returned it to the cabinet, reapplying the wards with precise wand movements. Some things were not meant to be dwelled upon. Some grief was not meant to be indulged. He'd made a promise to protect her son, and he would keep that promise. But that didn't mean he had to be kind about it. Couldn't be kind about it, really, because kindness to Harry Potter would invite questions he couldn't answer, would require explanations he couldn't give. Better to be the cruel potions master everyone expected, safer for everyone involved. Severus checked his watch again. Still 2 hours before the next addition to his experimental draft of peace. He should use the time productively, review essays perhaps, though the thought of reading another student's inane observations about the importance of stirring clockwise versus counterclockwise made him want to hex something. Or he could work on his correspondence with other potions masters, the academic discussions he carried on under his pseudonym. Instead, he found himself pulling a book from a shelf near his reading chair. Yes, he had a reading chair in his laboratory, a battered leather thing that had been old when he'd acquired it and was now practically archaeological. The book was not about potions. It was a muggle novel, detective fiction, the kind of thing that would horrify the Death Eaters he'd once associated with and puzzle the staff members who thought they knew him. Severus didn't particularly care what anyone thought. In the privacy of his laboratory, in the quiet hours of the night, he read what he pleased. And what pleased him with increasing frequency were stories about solving mysteries, about justice, flawed and imperfect perhaps, but justice nonetheless. Stories where the guilty were caught and the innocent vindicated, and everything made a certain logical sense that life rarely provided. He settled into his chair, book in one hand, wand in the other, in case the potion required attention. The dungeons were silent around him, except for the gentle bubble of the simmering draught of peace, and the occasional rustle of the nocturnal plants in their terrariums. Somewhere above, students would be studying or sleeping. Ghosts would be drifting through corridors, and portraits would be gossiping about whatever portraits gossiped about. Down here, Severus Snape read about a detective solving a murder in 1920s London and tried not to think about green eyes or past mistakes or the increasingly precarious position he occupied between light and dark, spy and teacher, the man he'd been and the man he'd become. 2 hours passed. The pocket watch chimed softly. He charmed it to do so, a reminder he couldn't ignore. Severus marked his place in the book and rose to attend to his potion. The drop of morning glory dew had to be added at precisely the right moment, and the window for right was approximately 30 seconds. He prepared carefully, removing the crystal vial from its storage case, uncorking it with steady hands despite the importance of what he was attempting. If this worked, if he could actually reduce the brewing time without compromising effectiveness, it would be a genuine advancement in the field. Published under a pseudonym, of course, and therefore credited to Tobias Prince rather than Severus Snape. But the work would remain even after his name was forgotten. That was what mattered. The work, the knowledge, the small ways he could perhaps balance the scales against all the damage he'd done, all the mistakes he couldn't undo. The dew fell into the potion, a single perfect drop, and the surface erupted in a cascade of silver sparks before settling back to a deep, tranquil purple. Exactly as his calculations had predicted, exactly as he'd hoped. Severus allowed himself a small smile, barely a curve of his lips, nothing that anyone else would recognize as pleasure. But it was there. The potion would need to simmer for another week, but the critical addition was complete. Now it was simply a matter of maintaining temperature and watching for signs of instability. Routine work, relatively speaking. He cleaned his workspace with the same meticulous care he applied to everything. Vanishing residue, organizing tools, updating his notes with observations about the dew's integration. Then he returned to his chair and his book, reading until his eyes grew heavy and the words began to blur. At some point, past 2 a.m, Severus finally abandoned the laboratory for his private quarters. A bedroom even more austere than the laboratory, with a narrow bed and little else. He didn't need comfort, didn't particularly want it. Sleep was a biological necessity, nothing more, and he approached it with the same grim efficiency he applied to everything else. But as he lay in darkness, waiting for unconsciousness, his mind drifted back to those terrariums, to the moonflowers blooming in shadow, releasing their strange and beautiful scent into air that never saw sunlight. Even in darkness, things could grow, could bloom, could create beauty that no one else would ever witness. It wasn't much of a philosophy, but some nights it was enough to let him sleep, and in the morning he would wake and don his teaching robes and terrify first years and take points from Gryffindor. And no one would ever know that Professor Snape tended night-blooming flowers and read detective novels and worked to create potions that might help people he would never meet. That was exactly how he wanted it. The greenhouses at Hogwarts were arranged in a neat row along the castle's eastern side, 7 glass structures that caught the morning sun and held it throughout the day, like carefully tended jewels. During daylight hours, they were the domain of students learning herbology, first years nervously handling bouncing bulbs, older students wrestling with venomous tentacula under Professor Sprout's watchful eye, NEWT students cultivating rare specimens for their practical examinations. But at night, when the students had retreated to their common rooms and the castle had settled into its evening rhythms. The greenhouses belonged entirely to Pomona Sprout. She made her way along the gravel path just after dinner, carrying a basket over one arm and humming tunelessly to herself. The autumn evening had turned properly cold, with a wind that promised frost by morning, and she'd bundled herself into a thick woolen cardigan that clashed spectacularly with her patched work robes. Fashion had never been a particular concern of Pomona's. Comfort and practicality were what mattered, and this cardigan, hand-knitted by her grandmother 40 years ago, provided both in abundance. Greenhouse 3 was her destination tonight. This was where she kept the more temperamental specimens, plants that required personal attention rather than the routine care that house elves could provide. The door recognized her approach and swung open with a creak that she kept meaning to oil, but never quite got around to. There was something comforting about that creak, a familiar sound that announced she was entering her own private sanctuary. The interior of Greenhouse 3 was warm and humid, thick with the scent of earth and growing things. Magical and mundane plants grew in cheerful profusion, arranged not with aesthetic consideration, but according to their needs and compatibility. A fanged geranium snapped half-heartedly at her as she passed, and she tapped its pot gently. None of that now. You've been fed today. The venomous tentacula in the far corner was her immediate concern. It had been looking peaked all week, leaves drooping, tendrils lacking their usual murderous enthusiasm. And despite several diagnostic charms, Pomona hadn't been able to identify the precise problem. Sometimes, plants were like people in that regard. They felt poorly without any obvious cause, and the best treatment was simply attention and time. She approached the large pot that housed the tentacula, noting that its main stalks had perked up slightly since this morning. Good. That was encouraging. From her basket, she withdrew a bottle of her own nutrient mixture, a recipe she'd developed over decades of trial and error, combining powdered dragon dung, essence of flobberworm, and several other ingredients that students would find considerably less appetizing than plant fertilizer ought to be. There we are, my dear, Pomona murmured, carefully applying the mixture around the tentacula's base, avoiding the snapping tendrils that, while not at full strength, could still deliver a painful bite. I think you've had a touch of root rot, haven't you? Nothing serious, but we'll need to watch it. I'll check again in the morning. The tentacula's leaves rustled, not quite a purr, but something approaching contentment. Pomona smiled and gave the pot a gentle pat before moving on to her next patient, a shrivel fig that had been producing undersized fruit. Its leaves needed trimming, and she set about the task with the comfortable efficiency of long practice, humming as she worked. This was her favorite time of day, these quiet evening hours in the greenhouse when she could tend her plants without interruption, without needing to watch students who might accidentally poison themselves or set something on fire. She loved teaching, genuinely loved watching young witches and wizards discover the wonders of magical botany. But there was something deeply satisfying about this solitary work, just her and the plants, and the knowledge accumulated over 40 years of devoted study. She'd just finished with the shrivel fig and was considering whether the Chinese chomping cabbages needed deadheading when she heard the familiar heavy tread of boots on the gravel path outside. A moment later, the greenhouse door opened to admit a figure so large he had to duck considerably to fit through the doorway. "Evening, Professor," Hagrid rumbled, his beetle-black eyes crinkling with warmth. "Thought I might find you here." "Good evening, Hagrid." Pomona set down her pruning shears and brushed soil from her hands. "Finished with your rounds?" "Aye. All the creatures are settled for the night. Even Buckbeak's calmed down. He's been in a right state since them Slytherins were taunting him during class." Hagrid's expression darkened momentarily, then cleared. "But that's not why I came by. I was thinking, if you're free, might we have our tea tonight?" Pomona smiled. Their weekly tea tradition had started almost by accident 5 years ago, when she'd encountered Hagrid returning from the forest looking exhausted and had offered him a cup from her thermos. Somehow, that single cup had evolved into a regular gathering, usually held on Thursday evenings when both of them had finished their immediate duties and could spare an hour for companionship and conversation. "I'd be delighted," she said. "Just let me finish up here. Another 10 minutes should do it. Shall we meet in the usual place?" "I'll get everything ready," Hagrid agreed, and ducked back out into the night, his footsteps receding along the path. Pomona completed her evening rounds with slightly more efficiency than usual, checking the remaining plants that needed attention, making notes in her worn journal about which specimens would require extra care tomorrow. The Chinese chomping cabbages did indeed need deadheading, but that could wait until morning. They'd survive one more night. She gathered her basket and tools, extinguished the greenhouse lanterns with a wave of her wand, and stepped out into the cold evening air. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of the forbidden forest, pine and earth, and something wilder, something that spoke of ancient magic and creatures that preferred darkness to daylight. The usual place was not, as one might expect, Hagrid's hut with its perpetual chaos of boiling kettles and suspicious pets. Instead, it was a small courtyard on the ground floor of the castle, tucked between the kitchens and the main staircase, that few people seemed to know existed. It had likely been a servants' area centuries ago, back when Hogwarts had employed human staff rather than house elves. Now it held only a weathered wooden bench, a few paving stones, and a stubborn patch of wild herbs that Pomona had never quite managed to identify, but suspected were very, very old. The courtyard had the advantage of being sheltered from the wind and, more importantly, being near the kitchens. By the time Pomona arrived, Hagrid had already arranged everything. The bench held a teapot under a knitted cozy, 2 mismatched mugs, a plate of what appeared to be proper bread and butter, not Hagrid's usual rock cakes, thank Merlin, and a bowl of soup that was still steaming gently. The house elves were happy to help, Hagrid explained, looking pleased with himself. Told them it were for Professor Sprout, and they brought out the good stuff. Pomona laughed. I do have a certain reputation in the kitchens. She'd made a point, over the years, of providing the house elves with fresh herbs for cooking, occasionally sharing unusual vegetables from her greenhouses, and simply treating them with the kindness and respect they deserved. In return, they'd adopted her as something of a favorite, and meals that came from the kitchens for her benefit tended to be especially fine. She settled onto the bench beside Hagrid. There was just enough room for both of them, though it was a near thing given his size, and accepted the mug of tea he poured for her. It was strong and sweet, exactly how she liked it, with a splash of milk that turned it a warm caramel color. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping tea and watching the steam rise in the cold air. This was the quality Pomona most appreciated about Hagrid's company. He understood that silence didn't need to be filled, that sometimes the best companionship was simply sitting together without the need for constant conversation. Finally, Hagrid spoke. "How are the students this term? Any promising ones in your classes?" Pomona considered the question while spreading butter on a piece of bread. Proper, fresh bread, still warm from the kitchens. Nothing like the rock-hard offerings Hagrid produced from his own oven. A few stand out. There's a Hufflepuff second year, Susan Bones, who has a real gift for understanding plant needs, not just following instructions, but truly understanding the why of things. And surprisingly, Neville Longbottom shows genuine talent despite his struggles in other subjects. "Ah, young Neville." Hagrid's face softened. "Good lad, that one. Nervous as a bowtruckle in a thunderstorm, but his heart's in the right place. He helped me with the flobberworms last week. Most students think they're boring, but he really looked at them, really saw them. That's the difference between competent students and truly gifted ones," Pomona agreed. "The ability to see. Not just look, but see. To understand that every living thing, whether it's a venomous tentacular or a flobberworm, has its own nature, its own needs, its own small dignity." Hagrid nodded enthusiastically, then paused to bite into his bread. After swallowing, his table manners had improved considerably since their teas had begun, Pomona noted with private satisfaction. He said, "Had a bit of trouble with a hippogriff today. Buckbeak's been sulky ever since Malfoy insulted him last week. Tried giving him ferrets, tried proper grooming, but he's still in a mood." "Creatures have long memories for slights," Pomona observed. "Plants too, in their way. I had a fanged geranium once that refused to bloom for an entire year after a student had been particularly rough with it during repotting. Sometimes they just need time to forgive." "Aye, but time's one thing we've got plenty of here, isn't it?" Hagrid gazed up at the castle walls rising around them, at the lit windows where students would be studying or chatting or engaging in the gentle mischief that came with youth. "Sometimes I think about how many students have come through Hogwarts. Hundreds, thousands, over the centuries. All of them learning, growing, then going off to live their lives. And we stay, teaching the next lot." It was an unusually philosophical observation from Hagrid, and Pomona turned to look at him more closely. His face, framed by that wild hair and beard, looked tired in the lamplight that spilled from a nearby window. He worked so hard, she knew, trying to prove himself worthy of his position, trying to overcome his expulsion and the stigma that came with it. And he was worthy, more than worthy. But he carried his insecurities like a heavy coat he could never quite take off. "We do stay," she said gently. "And it matters, Hagrid. What we do matters. Every student we teach, every creature or plant we help them understand and care for. That's knowledge passing forward, shaping how they'll treat the world. That's not a small thing." "I suppose." Hagrid took a long drink of his tea, then reached for the soup, ladling out generous portions into 2 bowls the house elves had provided. It was potato and leek, thick and creamy, with chunks of bread for dipping. Perfect for a cold night. "Sometimes I just wonder if I'm doing it right, you know? if they're really learning what they need to learn. Are they leaving your class with more understanding and compassion for magical creatures than they arrived with? Well, yeah, most of them. Then you're doing it right. Pomona accepted her bowl of soup and inhaled the savory steam. Hagrid, you have a gift for seeing the good in creatures that most people fear or dismiss. You teach students to look past their prejudices, to find wonder in beings they might otherwise ignore or mistreat. That's not just teaching facts, that's teaching empathy. And empathy is the most important lesson of all. Hagrid ducked his head, clearly pleased but embarrassed by the praise. You're too kind, Professor. I'm accurate. There's a difference. She smiled and tasted the soup. Excellent, as expected. The house elves had outdone themselves. And you do the same for me, you know. Our conversations remind me why I chose teaching in the first place. It's easy to get caught up in the daily frustrations, students who don't pay attention, plants that refuse to thrive despite perfect care, paperwork that breeds like horklumps. But then, we have these evenings, and I remember it's about care, about tending, about creating space for things to grow. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the soup warming them from the inside as the tea had warmed their hands. Around them, Hogwarts carried on its nightly routines. They could hear distant voices, footsteps on stairs, the occasional hoot of an owl. A portrait somewhere nearby was singing off-key, and someone laughed in response. "How's your venomous tentacula?" Hagrid asked eventually. "The one that's been poorly?" "Better, I think." She perked up a bit this evening after I gave her my special mixture. I suspect root rot, but it's not severe. She should recover with a bit of attention. Pomona set down her empty soup bowl and picked up her tea again. "How's your blast-ended Scroot breeding project coming along?" Hagrid's face lit up with the particular enthusiasm he reserved for his more experimental creature-keeping ventures. "Oh, they're fascinating, Pomona. Absolutely fascinating. Got 6 of them now, and they're growing like mad. I think if I can just figure out what they like to eat, please tell me you're not planning to introduce them to students." "Well, maybe the 6th years next term? Just for observation?" Pomona gave him a look that was half exasperation, half affection. "Hagrid, sometimes I think you see a dangerous creature and immediately think teaching opportunity, without considering the numerous ways it could go catastrophically wrong. But that's how you learn," Hagrid protested. "Hands-on experience. Can't learn about creatures just from books. You can, however, start with creatures that don't explode." "Where's the fun in that?" Despite herself, Pomona laughed. This was a familiar argument between them, one they'd had in various forms over the years. Hagrid's enthusiasm for dangerous creatures was matched only by his genuine belief that everything could be tamed, or at least understood, with sufficient kindness. She worried about him sometimes, worried about the risks he took, the injuries he sustained that he always dismissed as just scratches. But she also admired his unshakable faith in the fundamental goodness of all living things. It was naive, perhaps, but it was also beautiful. "Promise me you'll at least have proper safety equipment ready if you do introduce them to students," she said finally. "I promise. Dragon-hide gloves all round, and I'll keep the fire extinguishing spells ready." Hagrid grinned, clearly considering this a victory. They finished their tea as the evening deepened toward true night. The temperature continued to drop, and Pomona pulled her cardigan more tightly around herself. Soon she'd need to return to her quarters, prepare tomorrow's lessons, grade the essays that had been piling up on her desk. But not quite yet. These moments were too precious to rush. "Do you ever think about retiring?" Hagrid asked suddenly. "Not that you should," he added quickly. "You're a brilliant teacher, best herbology professor Hogwarts ever had. But do you ever think about it?" Pomona considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted, "when my knees ache from kneeling in greenhouse soil all day, or when I'm dealing with a particularly difficult class of students who think herbology is boring because plants don't fly or breathe fire. I think about a cottage somewhere, maybe Scotland, with a large garden, just me and my plants, no responsibilities beyond tending them. But then I have a student like Susan Bones or Neville Longbottom, someone who truly gets it, who sees the magic in growing things. Or I have an evening like this sitting with a friend, sharing tea and soup and conversation. And I think, where else would I find this? Where else would I belong so completely?" Hagrid nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know what you mean. I couldn't leave Hogwarts. This is home. More than anywhere else ever was. More than anywhere else ever could be," Pomona agreed softly. They sat together as the castle bells chimed 9 o'clock, as lights began winking out in student dormitories, as the night settled into its deepest quiet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, plants to tend, creatures to care for, students to teach. But tonight, in this small, forgotten courtyard, two teachers shared tea and understood without needing to say it that what they did mattered, that the care they showed to growing things, whether plant or creature or young witch or wizard, rippled outward in ways they might never fully see but could trust were real. Finally, Pomona rose, gathering the mugs and bowls to return to the kitchens. Hagrid stood as well, towering above her, but somehow never making her feel small. That was another thing she appreciated about him. His size might be intimidating to some, but he wore it gently, always aware of his own strength and careful not to overwhelm. "Same time next week?" he asked. "I wouldn't miss it," Pomona assured him. "Thank you for this, Hagrid. For the tea, the company, everything." "Thank you for listening," he replied, "and for reminding me why it matters." They parted ways at the courtyard entrance, Hagrid heading back to his hut to check on Fang and whatever other creatures he was currently harboring. Pomona making her way through the castle toward her quarters near the Hufflepuff common room. The stone corridors were quiet now, most students already in bed, or at least in their dormitories, preparing for sleep. As she walked, Pomona thought about growth, how it happened slowly, patiently, often invisibly, until suddenly you noticed a plant had doubled in size, or a student had finally grasped a concept they'd been struggling with for months. That was the nature of teaching, really. Slow, patient work that required faith in processes you couldn't always see. But that was all right. She had faith, had patience, had the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she was doing exactly what she was meant to do, in exactly the place she was meant to be. When she finally reached her quarters and settled into bed, surrounded by the faint, earthy scent that never quite left her skin no matter how thoroughly she washed, Pomona fell asleep, quickly, contentedly, already looking forward to tomorrow's work in the greenhouses and next week's tea with Hagrid. Some things, like the best friendships and the hardiest plants, just needed time and attention to flourish, and Hogwarts, ancient and patient, provided both in abundance. The castle had a particular quality after 9 o'clock in the evening, a settling that was almost audible if one listened carefully enough. It was the sound of hundreds of students retreating to their respective territories, of doors closing and fires being banked, of the daily bustle giving way to the gentler rhythms of night. Most of the professors had retired to their quarters by now. Minerva with her correspondence, Phileas with his singing plants, Severus with his experimental potions, Pomona likely already asleep after her tea with Hagrid. But some members of staff kept different hours, their routines shaped by the particular demands of their positions, or simply by personal preference. These quieter staff members moved through the castle's evening like familiar ghosts, each following their own well-worn paths, each finding peace in their own particular way. In the North Tower, Professor Sybil Trelawney was reorganizing her tea collection. The divination classroom was dim even during daylight hours, all heavy curtains and flickering candles, and the perpetual scent of incense that clung to everything like a persistent fog. At night, with only the candles providing illumination, it became almost dreamlike, shadows dancing across the walls, the various instruments of divination gleaming mysteriously in their cases. Sybil moved among her possessions with the careful precision of someone who appeared scattered but was actually quite methodical when no one was watching. The tea collection was housed in a large cabinet that took up most of one wall, its shelves lined with jars and tins of every conceivable variety. She'd been collecting for decades, since her student days really, acquiring rare blends from obscure shops, accepting gifts from former students who remembered her preferences, occasionally stumbling upon something interesting in Diagon Alley. Tonight, she was sorting them by type and potency, a task she performed quarterly to ensure nothing had gone stale or lost its divinatory properties. Some people thought tea leaf reading was the simplest form of divination, requiring little skill or genuine sight. Those people were wrong. The quality of the tea mattered enormously, as did its preparation, the temperature of the water, the shape of the cup, the light in which it was read, the emotional state of the reader, and the subject. Everything mattered if you truly understood the art. Darjeeling, first flush, she murmured to herself, holding a tin up to the candlelight to examine the label. Still good. Ceylon, needs using soon. Assam, plenty left. Lapsang Souchong. She paused, opening this tin to inhale deeply. The smoky scent was still strong, still potent. Good. Lapsang Souchong was excellent for readings involving danger or hidden enemies, the smoke somehow clarifying those darker visions. She set the tins back on their shelves in careful order, then moved to her oolong collection. These were more delicate, requiring more attention. A Taiwanese high mountain oolong that she saved for particularly important readings. A Chinese Tiguan Yin that had cost her 2 months' salary, but was worth every knut for its clarity. A Dan Kong oolong that... A small sound interrupted her sorting. Not quite a knock, more of a scratching. Sybil turned to find one of the school's cats, a tabby, not Mrs. Norris, sitting at her door, looking at her with expectant amber eyes. "Oh, hello, dear," she said, crossing to open the door more fully. Come in. Have you come for your evening reading?" The cat entered with the regal bearing that all cats seem to possess. as if conferring a great favour by their mere presence. Sybil smiled. Few people knew she often read tea leaves for the castle's cats. They couldn't drink the tea themselves, of course, but she could brew it while thinking of them, focusing on their essence, and the leaves would arrange themselves accordingly. It was unconventional, certainly not something she'd mentioned to the other staff, but the cats seemed to appreciate it, and Sybil had found their futures surprisingly interesting to glimpse. "Let's see what tonight holds for you," she said, setting a kettle to boil with a wandless charm and selecting a mild green tea, good for general readings, not too specific. While the water heated, she settled into her favorite chair and gestured for the cat to sit nearby. It did, curling into a neat loaf shape, purring softly. The ritual of tea preparation was meditative. Sybil had performed it thousands of times, but it never became rote, never lost its significance. Each cup was a question posed to the universe, an invitation for insight. She poured the hot water over the leaves, watched them unfurl and swirl, waited the appropriate time before straining them into her reading cup. A delicate thing with a handle worn smooth by years of use. The leaves settled into patterns that spoke to her trained eye. She saw a bird, freedom perhaps, or a journey, a cluster that might be flowers, growth, new beginnings. And there, near the rim, something that looked unsettlingly like a grim, though smaller, less defined. "Interesting," she murmured. The cat's purring had stopped, and it watched her with those knowing amber eyes. "You'll have an adventure soon, I think. Something unexpected. But be careful of dogs, or dog-like things. Best avoid them for a while." The cat made a small chirping sound that might have been agreement, or might have been skepticism. With cats, it was often hard to tell. It stood, stretched elaborately, then padded to the door and waited to be let out. Sybil obliged, and it departed without a backward glance, off to pursue whatever mysterious business occupied castle cats at night. Sybil returned to her tea collection, feeling the satisfaction that came from work done well, even if no one else knew about it, or would believe her if she told them. She knew most of the staff thought her a fraud, or at best deluded. Only Minerva showed her any real respect, and even that was grudging. But Sybil had the sight, had inherited it from her great-great-grandmother Cassandra, and whether others believed made no difference to the truth of what she saw. She continued her sorting, humming an old song her mother had taught her, and felt perfectly content in her cluttered tower with its incense and its mysteries and its 100 varieties of tea. Several floors below, in the library that occupied a significant portion of Hogwarts' East Wing, Madame Irma Pintz was cataloguing new acquisitions. The library after hours was Irma's true domain. During the day, it was invaded by students, careless students who dog-eared pages and spilled ink and failed to appreciate the precious nature of the volumes they handled with such casual disregard. She did her best to maintain order, to enforce the rules that kept the book safe, but it was exhausting work, an endless battle against entropy and adolescent thoughtlessness. But at night, the library was hers alone. She moved through the stacks with a lamp that cast a warm golden circle, trailing her fingers along spines as she passed, greeting old friends silently. Books had always made more sense to Irma than people. They were straightforward, honest, their contents never changing unless someone deliberately damaged them. A book about transfiguration theory was always about transfiguration theory. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't, didn't hide its nature behind polite lies. Tonight's acquisitions were spread across one of the study tables, 7 new volumes that had arrived that morning via owl post from Flourish and Blots, a updated edition of notable magical names of our time, a comprehensive guide to water plants of the British Isles, a theoretical work on wand lore, 2 historical texts about medieval wizarding communities, a book of collected correspondence between famous charms masters, and, most exciting, a first edition of Adalbert Waffling's magical theory that had somehow survived in pristine condition. Irma handled this last one with particular reverence, wearing special cotton gloves to prevent oils from her skin damaging the ancient binding. First editions were increasingly rare, especially of foundational texts like this one. The copy they'd had in the restricted section was falling apart despite preservation charms, and this new acquisition would allow her to retire the older copy and keep it safely stored. She opened the front cover carefully, inhaling the scent of old paper, one of her favorite smells in the world, and began the cataloguing process. First, a thorough examination for any damage, any signs of magical interference, any curses or hexes that might have been placed on the text. She'd found 3 cursed books in her career, and one of them had nearly taken her eyebrows off before she'd neutralized it. This one appeared clean. Good. Next came the administrative work, recording the title, author, publication date, condition, and provenance in her catalogue. She maintained both a physical ledger and a magical one, not trusting either system alone. She assigned it a shelf location in the restricted section, since Waffling's work, while not dangerous, was complex enough that first years trying to read it might accidentally hurt themselves, trying to understand concepts beyond their current magical education. As she worked, Irma became aware of a presence nearby. She looked up to find a portrait watching her, a witch in Elizabethan dress who occupied a frame near the transfiguration section. "Burning the midnight oil again, Irma?" the portrait asked. "It's barely past 9, Adelaide," Irma replied, though not unkindly. She'd known this portrait for decades, and Adelaide was one of the more sensible ones, not given to the dramatics that many portraits exhibited. Still, you spend too much time with books and not enough with people. Books are better company. Books don't argue with you because they can't talk back. That's not the same as being better company. Adelaide smiled, taking any sting from the words. Though I suppose I'm hardly one to advocate for human interaction, being made of paint and canvas myself. Irma allowed herself a small smile. "How are the other portraits tonight?" "Oh, the usual. Phineas Nigellus is being insufferable as always, complaining about students and modernity. The fat lady is gossiping about some first-year romance. Sir Cadogan tried to challenge a suit of armour to a duel and was quite offended when it didn't respond." Adelaide shook her head, her ruff rustling with the movement. "Sometimes I wonder if being a portrait brings out the worst in people, or if only the worst people agree to become portraits. Present company accepted, of course." "Oh, naturally. I'm delightful." Adelaide's smile widened. "What's the new book?" "Waffling's Magical Theory, first edition." "Oh my, that is exciting. I remember when that was first published. Caused quite a stir in academic circles. Half the scholars thought he was brilliant. The other half thought he was dangerously radical." Adelaide leaned forward as much as her frame would allow. May I watch you catalogue it? I always find your work soothing. If you like. They fell into companionable silence, Irma continuing her meticulous work while Adelaide observed. This was the quality of nighttime in the library that Irma treasured most. The quiet company of portraits who understood the value of books, who didn't disturb her work with inane questions or unnecessary chatter. During the day, students constantly interrupted. Madam Pins, where is this book? Madam Pins, can I take this to my common room? Madam Pins, my friend spilled pumpkin juice on a book. What should we do? At night, there were only the books and the occasional conversation with Adelaide or one of the other portrait scholars. And that was exactly how Irma preferred it. She finished with the waffling text and moved on to the others, each receiving the same careful attention. By the time she'd catalogued all 7 volumes and shelved them in their appropriate locations, the castle bells were chiming 10 o'clock. Time for my rounds, Irma announced, collecting her lamp. Don't catch anyone out of bed, Adelaide said, or do, if they deserve it. Always. Irma made her way through the library one final time, checking that all candles were safely extinguished, all books properly shelved, all windows secured. Then she locked the main doors with a complex charm that would alert her if anyone attempted unauthorized entry and departed for her own quarters, already looking forward to tomorrow evening's cataloguing session. Meanwhile, on the ground floor, Argus Filch was conducting his nightly patrol with Mrs. Norris, padding silently at his heels. Most students viewed Filch as something between a nuisance and a villain, the grumpy caretaker who seemed to delight in catching them out of bounds and assigning unpleasant punishments. They didn't understand, couldn't understand, what it meant to be a squib in a magical castle, surrounded by wonders he could see but never touch, never perform, never truly be part of. But at night, when the students were confined to their dormitories and the castle belonged to him and the other staff, Filch felt something approaching peace. He walked the familiar corridors with the confidence of someone who knew every stone, every shortcut, every hiding place. Mrs. Norris investigated corners and alcoves, her lamp-like eyes glowing in the darkness, alert for any sign of student mischief, or occasionally mice that needed chasing. Tonight, they were checking the 3rd floor, where the Weasley twins had been spotted earlier, looking suspicious. Filch didn't know what they were planning. The twins were infuriatingly clever at hiding their intentions, but he knew that look. He'd seen it on too many faces over his decades at Hogwarts, the look of students plotting something that would inevitably result in mess, damage, or chaos that he'd have to clean up. He paused at a tapestry that showed a wizard teaching trolls to dance, running his hand along the edge where it met the wall. Sometimes students hid things behind tapestries, dung bombs, fireworks, contraband from Zonkos. But this one revealed nothing suspicious, and Mrs. Norris showed no interest, which was usually a reliable indicator. They continued their patrol, Filch making notes in his little book about a scorch mark on the wall near the charms corridor. Someone had been practicing fire-making spells unsupervised, he'd wager. And a puddle of something suspicious near the Transfiguration classroom that he'd need to clean tomorrow. Probably just spilled pumpkin juice. But with students, you never knew. As they walked, Filch found himself thinking about his quick spell course, the one he'd ordered years ago and still worked through occasionally in the privacy of his office. The lessons never seemed to help. Magic apparently couldn't be learned from a correspondence course if you didn't have magic to begin with. But he kept trying. Hope, it seemed, was harder to kill than it should be. Mrs. Norris made a small sound and darted ahead, her attention caught by something in the shadows. Filch hurried after her. Well, hurried as much as his knees allowed. Age and decades of climbing, Hogwarts's innumerable stairs having taken their toll, and found her sitting before a suit of armor, staring up at it with what might have been curiosity. "What is it, my sweet?" he asked, bending down to scratch behind her ears. She purred, leaning into his hand, then looked back at the armor. Filch examined it more closely. Nothing seemed amiss. No students hiding inside, no signs of tampering. Perhaps Mrs. Norris had simply heard the armor settling, the small sounds that ancient metal made as it adjusted to temperature changes. Just the castle breathing, he told her. Nothing to worry about. They completed their patrol without finding any students out of bounds, which was both satisfying. It meant fewer reports to file, and slightly disappointing. Filch would never admit it, but sometimes the challenge of catching rule breakers was the most interesting part of his day. The rest was cleaning and maintenance, necessary work, but not exactly thrilling. Still, there was satisfaction in it, in keeping Hogwarts clean and functional, in ensuring that centuries-old stone and wood remained solid and safe. Students didn't appreciate it, of course, didn't appreciate him. But Filch had long since stopped expecting appreciation. He had Mrs. Norris, he had his work, and he had the nighttime castle when it was quiet and almost peaceful. That was enough. They returned to his office, where Filch prepared Mrs. Norris's dinner, a small bowl of choice bits he'd saved from the kitchens, and settled into his chair to review his notes and plan tomorrow's cleaning schedule. Mrs. Norris ate delicately, then jumped onto his lap, purring and kneading his legs with her paws. "Good girl," he murmured, stroking her fur. "Good, sweet girl." In the hospital wing, Madame Poppy Pomfrey was preparing for tomorrow's inevitable injuries. 40 years as Hogwarts matron had taught her many things, but chief among them was that prevention was impossible when dealing with adolescent wizards. Students would injure themselves, fall victim to pranks, succumb to minor illnesses, and generally require medical attention at a rate that would alarm any reasonable person. The best she could do was be prepared. She moved through her domain with brisk efficiency, checking supplies and brewing potions that would be needed. Pepper-up potion for colds. They were entering the season for sniffles and coughs, and she'd need gallons of the stuff by December. Scaligro, though she hoped it wouldn't be necessary. Regrowing bones was unpleasant for everyone involved. Essence of dittany for cuts and burns. Calming draught for students having panic attacks over exams. Dreamless sleep potion for those troubled by nightmares. The work was methodical, soothing in its familiarity. Poppy had made these potions so many times she could do it in her sleep, her hands moving through the steps automatically, while her mind wandered. She thought about her patients, current and past, the students she'd treated over decades of service. Some faces she remembered clearly, others had blurred together into a general impression of youth and vulnerability. She thought about tomorrow's likely injuries. Friday afternoons meant Quidditch practice, which always resulted in at least one student arriving with a twisted ankle or minor concussion. The Weasley twins would probably blow something up in charms class, resulting in singed hair or minor burns. Some first year would inevitably mishandle a potion and need treatment for boils or odd-colored skin. But she'd be ready. She was always ready. As the clock struck 11, Poppy finished her preparations and settled into her office chair for a cup of tea before bed. The hospital wing was empty tonight, a blessing, and quiet except for the gentle ticking of clocks and the soft rustle of clean linens. This was her kingdom, small but important, and she ruled it with the fierce competence born of long experience and genuine care for her patients. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, its injuries, its demands. Tonight, she sipped her tea and rested, and felt grateful for both the work and the quiet moments between. Emma Thornberry had fallen asleep in the Ravenclaw common room. It wasn't intentional. She'd simply settled too comfortably into her window seat after dinner, watching the castle lights wink on one by one, thinking about professors and their secret evening lives. The cushion she'd conjured, despite its tendency to deflate, had been just soft enough. The rain against the glass had provided a gentle rhythm, and somewhere between wondering what Professor McGonagall did after hours and imagining Professor Flitwick's private quarters, her eyes had grown heavy and closed. She woke to silence, not the comfortable buzz of common room activity, but true silence, the kind that only came deep in the night when even the most dedicated students had abandoned their homework and retreated to bed. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see by. The enchanted ceiling above showed a sky full of stars, crisp and clear now that the rain had passed. Emma sat up slowly, disoriented. Her neck ached from the awkward angle she'd been sleeping at, and her legs had gone slightly numb from being curled beneath her for so long. She fumbled for her wand, still tucked in her robes thankfully, and cast a quiet Lumos. The pale light revealed an empty common room, chairs pushed neatly against tables, books shelved, even the chess set in the corner packed away. Everyone had gone to bed, including, apparently, whoever should have woken her and suggested she do the same. Emma checked the clock on the mantel, a beautiful thing that showed not just the time but also the phases of the moon and the positions of various planets. midnight. She'd been asleep for hours. She should go to bed. She'd climb the stairs to her dormitory, change into her nightclothes, slip beneath the covers of her four-poster bed, and sleep properly until morning. That would be the sensible thing to do. Instead, Emma found herself moving toward the common room door. She wasn't sure what prompted it, curiosity, perhaps, or the residue of her earlier wondering about the castle's nighttime life. But she wanted to see Hogwarts at this hour, wanted to witness the version of the school that existed when students were absent, when only staff and portraits and the castle itself remained awake. The bronze eagle knocker on the door regarded her with its usual inscrutability. "What grows stronger the more you share it?" it asked in its cool, measured voice. Emma considered. A riddle about sharing. "Knowledge," she said softly, mindful of sleeping students above. "Well reasoned," the eagle replied, and the door swung open. The corridor beyond was dark except for the occasional torch burning in its bracket, casting pools of warm light that left deep shadows between them. Emma hesitated on the threshold. Students weren't technically forbidden from being in corridors at night, There was no formal curfew at Hogwarts, but there was a strong understanding that after a certain hour, one should be in one's dormitory. Wandering about at midnight would certainly raise questions if she encountered a professor or Filch. But the corridor was empty, and the castle seemed almost to be inviting her forward, the way a familiar friend might gesture for you to follow. Emma stepped out, letting the door close softly behind her. The castle at night was different. Not just darker, not just quieter, but fundamentally transformed, as if it became more itself in these hours when it didn't need to accommodate hundreds of students. The shadows felt deeper, yes, but also somehow protective rather than threatening. The stones seemed to breathe in a way she'd never noticed during the day, a slow rhythm like the chest of some enormous sleeping creature. She walked carefully, keeping her footsteps light, her wand light dim. A portrait to her left, a witch in medieval robes, stirred in her frame but didn't wake fully, simply adjusted her position and continued sleeping. Further along, she heard voices and quickly extinguished her light, pressing herself against the wall. Two portraits were gossiping in frames that hung opposite each other across the corridor. Simply scandalous, and I told her so, one was saying. You tell everyone everything, Beatrice. That's hardly newsworthy, the other replied. Well, someone has to maintain standards. If I don't inform her that her hair looks like a bird's nested in it, who will? Common decency might suggest no one needs to inform her of that. Common decency is precisely the problem with modern portraiture. Emma crept past while they argued, smiling despite her nervousness. The portrait's conversation reminded her that the castle was never truly empty, never truly sleeping. It was layered with consciousness, human, magical, architectural, all coexisting in this impossible space. She descended a staircase. It was stationary, thankfully, not one of the ones that moved, and found herself on the 5th floor. Here the corridors were wider, the ceilings higher, and the windows looked out over the grounds. Emma moved to one and peered out. The grounds were beautiful in the moonlight. The lake reflected the stars perfectly, creating the illusion that the sky continued beneath the earth. The forbidden forest was a dark mass on the horizon, mysterious and somehow alive, even from this distance. And there, she could just make out Hagrid's hut, a warm glow visible in one window. He was still awake then, probably tending to some creature or another. A sound behind her made Emma turn quickly, her heart suddenly pounding. But it was only a house elf, carrying a stack of linens so tall the elf was barely visible behind them. "Oh," the elf squeaked, nearly dropping the linens in surprise. "Miss should be in bed. It is very late. I know, I'm sorry," Emma whispered. "I fell asleep in the common room and just woke up. I was just walking a bit before bed." The house elf regarded her with enormous eyes that seemed to see more than Emma was comfortable with. Then, slowly, the elf smiled. "Sometimes the castle shows itself best at night," the elf said quietly, "when the young masters and misses sleep and the old stones can breathe. But miss, must be careful. Not all who walk these halls at night are friendly." "Who else walks them?" Emma asked, genuinely curious. "Ghosts, sometimes, though they are mostly kind. Portraits, gossiping as they always do. Peeves, but he sleeps now. Even poltergeists need rest. And the professors, making their rounds or tending their own business." The house elf shifted the linens to a more secure position. "And the castle itself walks, in its way, Corridors move, rooms appear and disappear, staircases decide to lead elsewhere. The castle is more awake at night than during the day, miss. More itself. Emma absorbed this information, understanding it to be valuable in ways she couldn't quite articulate. "Thank you," she said. "I'll be careful." The house elf nodded and continued on, the stack of linens floating slightly ahead now, probably with the help of magic Emma couldn't see. She watched it go. This small creature that helped maintain Hogwarts in ways students rarely acknowledged or even noticed. She continued her wandering, drawn by an impulse she didn't entirely understand. The castle seemed to guide her, or perhaps she was simply following some internal map built from 4 years of living here. Down another corridor, past the library, where she could see a faint light under the door, and guessed Madame Pince was still working. Around a corner where a suit of armor stood sentinel and seemed to nod slightly as she passed. Eventually, she found herself in the entrance hall, that vast space with its marble staircase and the high ceiling. During the day, it was always full of students, hurrying to class, chattering, laughing, occasionally fighting. Now it was cathedral quiet, solemn in its emptiness, the marble gleaming in the torchlight. Emma stood in the center and simply breathed, feeling the space around her, feeling the weight of the castle above and below. This was Hogwarts, not just a school, not just a building, but something alive and ancient and impossibly complex. A place that held generations of students, that kept them safe, that shaped them in ways they wouldn't understand until years later. A place that, she realized with sudden clarity, loved them. It seemed an absurd thought. Buildings didn't love. Stone and wood and magic didn't have emotions. And yet she felt it, had always felt it, really, but never articulated it this clearly. Hogwarts loved its students the way a parent loved children, with fierce protection and gentle patience, with tolerance for mistakes and a pride in achievements. It moved staircases to help confused first years find their way. It revealed rooms when they were needed. It maintained warmth in winter and coolness in summer, provided food and shelter and space to grow. And it provided space for the professors too, she thought. Private quarters where they could be themselves, greenhouses and laboratories, and studies where they could pursue their own interests and passions. The castle didn't just house teachers and students. It gave them all what they needed to thrive. Remarkable, isn't it? Emma spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A ghost had materialized behind her, not one she recognized. An elderly wizard in robes that suggested he'd died several centuries ago. "The castle, I mean," the ghost continued, his voice echoing slightly in that way ghostly voices did, the way it feels at night. "I've been here for 400 years, give or take a decade, and I never tire of this feeling. The sense that the castle is most truly itself when the living rest." "I didn't mean to disturb anyone," Emma said quietly. "Oh, you haven't disturbed me. I was simply passing through." The ghost smiled. "You're the Ravenclaw girl who sits in the window seat, aren't you? Always watching, always wondering. I've noticed you." "You have?" "Portraits gossip, but ghosts observe. We see patterns the living miss, notice the students who are truly paying attention rather than simply going through motions." He drifted closer, though not so close as to make her uncomfortable. Ghosts understood personal space, even if they didn't occupy physical space themselves. "What are you wondering about tonight?" Emma considered lying, then decided honesty was easier. The professors. Where they go after classes end. What they do when we're not watching. The ghost's smile widened. Ah, the secret lives of teachers. Yes, I can see why that would fascinate you. He was quiet for a moment, seeming to think. I was a professor once, taught astronomy, back when it was still called celestial studies. And I can tell you this, what you're imagining is probably quite close to the truth. What do you mean? You're imagining that they're people, aren't you? Not just the authority figures you see in classrooms, but complete individuals with private interests and quiet pleasures and moments of vulnerability. You're imagining McGonagall knitting, perhaps, or Flitwick conducting music, or Sprout having tea with Hagrid while discussing plants and creatures. The ghost's eyes twinkled. And you'd be right. Oh, perhaps not in the exact details, but in the essential truth that teachers are human, that they have lives beyond teaching, that they chose this work not because they lack other options, but because they genuinely care about passing knowledge forward. Emma found herself smiling. Is it different? Being a professor, different from other jobs? Entirely different, the ghost said firmly. Most work is about creation or maintenance, building something or keeping something running. Teaching is about transformation. You take young people who are rough and uncertain and ignorant in the literal sense, not knowing things yet, and you help shape them into witches and wizards who can navigate the world. It's alchemy, really, but with human souls instead of base metals. He drifted towards the marble staircase, gesturing for her to follow. Emma did, curious now. I've watched generations of teachers come and go, the ghost continued. Some were brilliant but cold, caring more for their subjects than their students. Some were warm but ineffective, unable to actually convey knowledge despite good intentions. The best, the ones like McGonagall and Flitwick, and even grumpy Snape, they understand that teaching is relationship, not friendship precisely, but a particular bond that forms between someone who knows and someone who wants to know. They'd reached the first landing, where a large window looked out over the grounds. The moon was lower now, approaching the horizon, and the sky had that particular quality of deepest night. The hour before dawn begins its slow approach. The professors you're wondering about, the ghost said. They each found their own way to balance the demands of teaching with their need to remain themselves. McGonagall with her private kindnesses, Flitwick with his music, Snape with his research, Sprout with her friendships. They all understand something crucial, that you can't pour from an empty vessel. To teach effectively, to give students what they need, you must first ensure you're receiving what you need, whether that's quiet time with plants or challenging potions work, or simply a cup of tea with a friend. Emma thought about this, about the professors she'd seen crossing the grounds earlier, about their separate paths to dinner, their individual lives resuming after classes ended. Do you miss it? She asked. Teaching? The ghost was quiet for a long moment. Yes and no, he said finally. I miss the satisfaction of watching understanding dawn in a student's eyes. I miss the discussions with colleagues who genuinely cared about their work. But I don't miss the exhaustion, the endless marking, the political complications of academic life. He smiled. Now I simply observe. Watch students grow and change. Offer occasional advice to those who seem to need it. It's enough. They stood together in comfortable silence, living girl and long-dead professor, watching the ground slowly lighten as true night began its gradual surrender to dawn. "You should return to your common room," the ghost said gently. "Get a few hours of proper sleep before breakfast. Your professors will be up soon enough, preparing for another day of teaching, and you'll need to be alert for your classes." Emma nodded, recognizing the wisdom in this. "Thank you for talking with me, for explaining." "Thank you for wondering," the ghost replied. "Too many students simply accept what they see without questioning what might lie beneath. The fact that you wonder, that you imagine your teachers as complete people with private lives, that suggests you'll become the sort of witch who sees people rather than simply roles. That's valuable." He began to fade, becoming translucent, then nearly invisible. His voice came from nowhere and everywhere. "The castle sleeps but dreams, young Ravenclaw. And in its dreams, it holds all of us, student and teacher, ghost and portrait, house elf and cat. We are all part of its story, all threads in its ancient tapestry. Remember that." Then he was gone, and Emma was alone on the staircase. She made her way back to Ravenclaw Tower, answering the eagle's riddle. What belongs to you, but others use it more than you do? Your name. And slipping into the common room. It was exactly as she'd left it, empty and quiet. The fire burned down to almost nothing. Emma climbed the spiral staircase to her dormitory, moving carefully to avoid waking her roommates. She changed into her night clothes as quietly as possible and slipped into bed, pulling the curtains around her four-poster. Sleep should have come immediately. She was exhausted, had been up far too late, needed rest before tomorrow's classes. But her mind was too full, turning over everything she'd seen and heard and understood. The castle did love them. The professors were people with private joys and quiet struggles. Hogwarts was more than a school. It was a home, a sanctuary, a place where hundreds of lives intersected and influenced each other in ways both obvious and invisible. And perhaps, Emma thought drowsily, perhaps that was the real magic, not the spells they learned or the potions they brewed, but the way this impossible place brought together so many different souls and helped them all become more than they would have been alone. Professor McGonagall writing letters in tartan slippers, Professor Flitwick conducting singing plants, Professor Snape tending moonflowers in darkness, Professor Sprout sharing tea with Hagrid, Madame Pince cataloguing books with portrait companions, even Filch walking his rounds with Mrs. Norris, finding purpose in maintaining the castle's physical integrity. They were all part of it, all necessary, all contributing to the spell that made Hogwarts what it was. Emma's eyes finally closed. Her breathing slowed and deepened. Around her, the castle continued its ancient rhythms, stones settling, portraits murmuring, house elves working, professors sleeping or not sleeping according to their natures. And in the morning, it would all begin again. Students would wake and dress and hurry to breakfast. Professors would appear at the high table, ready to teach another day's lessons. The great hall would fill with laughter and conversation. Magic would happen in classrooms throughout the castle. But Emma would remember this night, this glimpse behind the curtain, this understanding that everyone here, student and teacher alike, was both ordinary and extraordinary, both mundane and magical. She would remember, and she would carry that knowledge forward, that awareness that seeing people truly, completely, was perhaps the most important magic of all. Outside her window, the sky continued its slow shift from black to navy to the deep blue that preceded dawn. The stars faded one by one. The moon set below the horizon, and Hogwarts, ancient and patient, held them all safe while they slept.